Welcome to the library lived in. My name is Anise, and this is my co-host Lisa.
Hello.
And this month we're going to be talking about a book called The Island at the Center of the World, the epic story of Dutch Manhattan and the forgotten colony that shaped America by Russell Shorto. So I will say up front that I haven't finished this book yet. I had the audiobook, which I think you had the audiobook also.
Yes.
But it's very long. It's like 14 and a half hours. And this is actually the first nonfiction book that we have selected. And so I'm still working through it, and I'm going to finish, but I just haven't done it yet. But I know that you finished, Lisa, and you have rated the book.
I have. I think I rated it a 5. I might have rated it a 4, but I think I rated it a 5. I would totally read it again, and I would buy it.
Nice.
It was fantastic.
Nice. I've enjoyed what I've gotten through so far. And so I think with this being a nonfiction book and having so many people and so many events going on, that our normal outline may not apply as much. So we're just gonna take things as they come. So first I'll ask you, how much did you actually know about the Dutch colonies before you read this?
So in the book, he describes kind of like the general American knowledge of, like our background, our history, and starting with the Puritans in New England. And I was like, yeah, that's me. Apparently the school system or my parents or I've been failed in life. I knew none of it. So.
Well, I didn't know very much. I knew that New York had formerly been New Amsterdam for a short time. That was pretty much it. So I was really excited to learn more about it. So I think the main idea behind this book, it was the author trying to show that the Dutch settlement had a bigger influence on America now than we usually give them credit for. Which I've read a lot of reviews and differing opinions of people agreeing with that or saying the reason why we don't, like most people don't know any of this is because it didn't have that big of an impact. So what were your thoughts about that idea?
So I don't know. I don't feel like I'm educated enough in the whole big perspective, to have like fully knowledgeable opinion. I do think, so in the book, the author talks about, like the victors write the history books. And I think there's a certain amount of truth to that, that, things get cut out or they get rewritten or retold in the way that, we want to tell them, or that we see them. But that doesn't negate all other culture that is already there. So I think saying that New Amsterdam doesn't have an effect or that the people there didn't, like that their culture and traditions and customs didn't get passed down would be kind of harsh. I think that it does have more of an impact than we give it credit for, just because it hasn't been put in the history books the same way.
Right.
So I think it does matter.
Yeah, I agree. And I thought it was really interesting seeing how different the Dutch settlements were to the English ones, because basically all that we hear about is the Puritans and how they were like so like strict and like, yeah, exactly. And so you just like imagine everyone over here at that time just like all wearing black and like farming and not really doing much else. But some of the stories he shares about New Amsterdam and the Dutch settlements, they sounded like kind of rough places. like a melting pot, and there's like pirates and like all kinds of stuff going on.
Yes. I was having little flashbacks to Pirates of the Caribbean and the little, like little island stop on the way,
Mhm.
That's completely my vision when I was reading the early history.
Mhm. Yeah, and he also talked a lot at the beginning of the book about Henry Hudson, which I found super interesting because I knew his name, of course, but I didn't know anything about him really.
Right.
And so reading his story was really interesting, in that he was hired by the Dutch to find a passage to Asia through Canada somehow, and because they thought that there was a passage. And so instead, he decided to go a different way once they got sailing. And they kept thinking that they found it in all these places in the New York area. They didn't end up finding it, so he went back, and then they were mad that he didn't do what they wanted. And so he tried again, but after being out there for so long and like running out of food, his crew mutinied, and they just set him on a little boat and said, "See ya." And that's how he died.
Right. Really not a glorious end. It was really sad.
Yeah, it was totally not what I expected.
Exactly. Yeah, it was really sad, miserable way to go. But he really just, I think, was driven after a while, to the point of not considering anybody else, or it's pretty bad.
Yeah. So what were the other parts of the early history that stood out to you or that you wanted to talk about?
I just thought the whole of it was fascinating.
Uh-huh.
I thought it was interesting, the way it went back and forth between the Dutch feeling like they had a claim versus the English feeling like they had a claim. Of course, Henry Hudson was English, but he was working for the Dutch when he came, and that played into some of the legal dispute later between the countries, and their reasons for coming. I didn't know a whole lot about Amsterdam, about the Dutch culture at that time. So the whole idea that they were sort of welcoming everybody from Europe and sort of the safe haven of Europe at the time, and how that led into, the way that New Amsterdam sort of developed, like everybody's welcome, it's so different from, like you said, the Puritans and the New England colonies, and we're coming for religious freedom, right? Mm-hmm. So they're both, I don't know, accepting in their own way, but not in different, not in other ways. Mm-hmm. But it was just very interesting to see how they were so different and how it came about.
Right, and something else that I thought was interesting was that actually a lot of the pilgrims who came over on the Mayflower, and then the first ship after the Mayflower was called the Fortune, and they had already, like groups of people had already left England and were in Holland at that time, in Leyden, which is mentioned in this book. But they were already over there, like living among the Dutch, and then they came over to America. And so I imagine that had some kind of impact on the Dutch people who started to come.
Definitely.
Yeah, like you said, and they had different things they wanted to do.
Yeah, definitely. Like you said, it was, I don't know, pirates and kind of craziness and rough around the edges. I think the other thing I found interesting is like they just had this, the kind of settlement as a whole had this strong idea that they needed to be treated like all the other Dutch citizens. Like why? Because I'm here, I get less rights, mm-hmm. So this was a new understanding for me to see that You know, it wasn't, the colonies weren't put there by the country per se, but by the East India Company. So it was a business, you know, and the way that they were treated as, how it talks about being treated as military outposts and not being treated as a colony like we think of early American colonies being. So having the rights to govern and be involved in all of that wasn't a thing, but they weren't used to that. They were used to being able to speak their mind and being able to have more involvement. I just found that interesting that, you know, once you have some freedom and some ability to participate in the decisions that are affecting your life, nobody wants them taken away. Right.
Yeah, and I think that also makes a difference in how we view these different settlers, because it seems like always with the Pilgrims, we're always like, oh, they were so brave, like they just wanted freedom, they were just getting away no matter how bad it was, to be able to set up this new country. But the Dutch weren't there for that reason. And so it makes sense that their settlements and the way that they were doing things would be so different.
Right. Right. Definitely. I thought it was interesting too. I don't know. What did you think? Did you know the history with, you probably did. You're a better student of world history than I did. But with Spain and the breakaway of the Dutch from the Spanish and how that played into the history of.
No, I actually haven't gotten to that part yet. So you can tell me about it.
I'll get it. I'm not going to get it right because I don't have like notes sketched out or whatever, but there was discussion about I don't know if it was just a portion of Amsterdam or not, or of the Netherlands that had been under Spanish control previously. And there was the big fight for independence from them, right? And so the original settlement in Manhattan was there because they were trying to give themselves a better military advantage and a better advantage business-wise against the Spanish at that time. And so it was very, very important at the beginning of the settlement. But once they broke away, it became less crucial as far as a country. And then it kind of just became like, oh, the extra little group over there.
Right.
Right. So that was interesting. They kind of got sort of the shaft afterward, after they played their important part.
Right. That is interesting. And I think it's also something we don't think about a lot is that, like, in the preceding couple of centuries, it was Spain and Portugal who were like the explorers and who were going out and finding all these new places. And so, like, they had a lot of power. And then everyone else is like, oh, we want to get in on this too. And so the Dutch started to go out and the English started to go out. And then like on both sides of the Atlantic, the English end up winning and like colonizing more places and spreading more. And I'm not sure how much that has to do with just maybe even the size difference between the countries and the populations, or the resources, or why that happened the way it did.
Well, yeah, and yeah, no, sorry, go ahead. It's just kind of a lot to wrap your head around, like how much plays into this. It's such a big thing.
Yeah, for sure. So something else that the author does in this book is he kind of he brings out the differences between the Dutch settlements and the English, but also some of the similarities between them. And a lot of the things that he did talk about did seem familiar. And I think in kind of a way where you're not sure, like it's believable that the influence could have come just as much from the Dutch as it did from the English. Did any of that stand out to you or was memorable?
I'm not sure if I'm thinking of the same thing that you are, but some of the things that he talked about with the Dutch culture, I felt like, oh, that's familiar. And then he named sort of specific things if you get into the New York area, which I haven't been able to spend any time up there, but where he talks about the names of streets and the names of areas or people and just vocabulary that's come, into the American language. The one I'm thinking of right now is cookie. The reason that we call it cookie, but the British call it biscuit, right? Is that it comes from the Dutch word. And so there were several things like that he mentioned that I thought, oh, okay. So I just feel like I said, you can't eradicate a complete culture. I mean, those people pass down things to their children and their friends and people that they're around. And what did you think?
I think what stood out to me more was just like the general maybe not cultural things per se, but like citizenship type things. Like that they valued free trade and individual rights and religious freedom. And like we said before, we're just so used to just hearing only about the English, but they weren't the only ones that influenced that area and everything else that came that like spread out from there into the colonies. And so it's a lot to wrap your mind around. And I'm only halfway through the book. So
I feel like it's a more beautiful picture though. I don't know if you to say, like, to stop and appreciate that there are bits of our culture, like modern day America, that have come from all over the world, right? So in Amsterdam, they had people that were coming sort of as refugees from all over Europe and the people that came from there. And then you had the people from England that came. And then throughout the years in the States, we've had so much, right, immigration, so much people that just different, all the different things that have happened in the world that have brought people here from all over. And because we've had sort of a more open door than some other places, then we have like all of these neat things and traditions from different cultures that we can share in.
Yeah, I agree. I like that also. So I think we've gotten to the end of my notes because I haven't gotten very far into the book. Was there anything else that you specifically that you wanted to talk about?
I think you read very much yet. I'm not sure where he talks about the records that kind of started him off on this whole project.
Like, that was at the very beginning.
I think he revisits it.
Oh, okay.
Again, but that's good to know. I just thought it was fascinating, the story of how, like why don't we know anything about this, right? Not just do the victors write the history books, but why don't we know anything about this? Well, there haven't been any records, and what little there has been have not been great. They've been sort of poor copies or poor translations that have been passed down. And
well, also there was like a language thing, right? That
right.
The Old Dutch is like even
different.
Dutch people can't read it.
Yes. He actually talks about that later too, is that I think there comes a point where like the people from Amsterdam that would come visit, like their Dutch didn't even match up with the Dutch that was in Manhattan because the people here kind of because of what had happened in the States and with the conflict with the other colonies around Manhattan, then they had kind of clung to their traditions more. Whereas the people that, like back home in Amsterdam, things had kind of continued changing as things do over time and evolving. And so when they came to visit, then there was language difference, you know, at the same time.
Right.
Right. So I thought that was fun. But yeah, so after several years and attempts and there's just this whole kind of, he goes over this whole history of what happens to the records of this people, basically, right, from the Dutch East India Company and from the government itself, and what happens, where do they end up? And so he kind of goes over a little bit like through the different battles when they start in with England and who takes the records, and then they end up sitting in a damp ship hold for a while, and then they get taken back and forth, and anyways, they end up lost, and then they're rediscovered, and so they're still translating them now. And so Russell Shorto has been sort of an assistant to the gentleman that's translating him. And if I were good, I would have his name down. But this guy, that's been his life work, basically, after he finished university, then that was the opportunity that came to him. And that's what he's been doing his whole life. And he's still working on it, which I think is pretty amazing life work, right?
Yeah, definitely. So something else I did forget to mention was it talks a lot about the encounters and the relationships that they had with the Native Americans, which I was familiar with the story about the island being purchased for $24, which is mentioned in this book, and it wasn't exactly that simple as I thought it was, because the Indians had a different understanding of what this deal was than the newcomers did.
Yes.
And so that's where a lot of the tensions and troubles came from. And so he shares a lot of the encounters that they had. A lot of them seem to be pretty bloody and not good encounters at all. So what did you think of those?
I just think it's interesting because I think there are a few people that made the effort to get to know the traditions and the different tribes and the different, like the differences in culture between the tribes, and that it mattered to them, right? Like to get to know these people and to care. But as a whole, it's still being run, right? This is still a business opportunity, and the people that are in charge of the business don't care, right? And that's what matters. So there are some really ugly sort of things that come out and that happen. And some of the leadership of they replaced the leadership. I don't know if they call it the governor. I think it's the governor. They replaced him several times kind of throughout the history of the colony because of poor mismanagement or because the person just can't handle it. They can't manage. And so some of the leadership is really terrible towards the Native Americans, whereas some of the people that have lived there for many years from the beginning seem to have a better relationship. You know, so I find that interesting. If you're going there maybe to live in this new place and make a home, then you maybe treat the people like neighbors. If you're going there because you want to take something and you feel like it's your right, then you don't care. So, I don't, have you reached Vanderdonk yet? Do you know who Vanderdonk is yet?
I think I'm at the beginning of him being introduced.
Okay. It's while he's there. It's in that chunk of the book. There's a pretty terrible experience where they've had good relationships and good good things going on. And I forget who it is, but there's one gentleman who's like for years and years and years, like he's gone back and forth trading, and and it talks about how like the governor sends out a party to attack the Native Americans, and one of them turns up on the doorstep of this one colonist, and the colonist had found out about it and had told the guy not to do it. You know, don't do this to these people. And he sent them, like he just ignored them, sent them out anyway. So when the Native American shows up on his doorstep, he said, you need to leave. You need to get your people out of here. This is us. But the Native American didn't think it would be them. He thought it was going to be, I think it's the English that were closer at the time. The English or the French were on either side. It was one of them. But they totally just trusted him because they'd had this great relationship for years, and said, no, you have to get out. You have to get out. So I just thought it was so sad and miserable that one person can undo so much, you know?
Yeah, it really is. I just barely got to the very beginning of that part, but so do you want to tell me a little bit about, I assume that the book ends with like the transition from New Amsterdam to New York.
Yes, it does. And I'm a little rough on all the politics part of it. So Peter, and I'm not going to say his last name right, but I always feel like it's Stuyvesant, and that's not how you say it in Dutch. It's Stuyvesant or similar to that. Was the governor of appointed by the Dutch East India Company at the time. And you have Vanderdonk is trained as a lawyer in Amsterdam, and is hired by the Dutch East India Company to go work for them. And he goes, and I think he just works for them for a short time. I think it's less than a year, because his idea of what's right based on his legal training and sort of the modern thinking of the schools that he attended don't mesh with the business and politics of the company. And so he ends up leaving, but he stays in the colony, and he starts becoming sort of a defender of the people. And he looks after them, and he just sort of becomes sort of a natural leader within the group. So they don't get along. Him and Stuyvesant don't get along. And so there's sort of this building tension over time. It just becomes a bigger and bigger and bigger problem. And meanwhile, you have the politics going on at home in Europe between England, between the Dutch, who's really going to be in control, what's really going on. One of the previous governors, whose name I can't remember, who had been pulled and replaced, decided he was going to start his own colony or his own plantations, and he had gotten together a bunch of people and settled up an area just south, I believe, of the Dutch colony. So, and I think that was a French group or Swiss group that he'd gathered together. So there's like a whole nother line of contention over here, and the company's getting worried about everybody's encroaching on them, right? Everybody this is our area. We've been here the longest. We've done all this work. The English had a few settlements by then, and they were growing to the point of being a concern to the Dutch. So it just was getting bigger and more heated and more of a problem. And it eventually turned into actual fighting and into actual battle. Stuyvesant was asked to stand down, and trying to think who it was that came. And he refused at first. And it was going to mean like the whole of the colony would be attacked. And the people were not behind him. The people basically told him, just stand down, and just let us be and let us move on. And so I think he finally did. But it just, you know, they just didn't have it in them to fight on all these different fronts, you know, in Europe and the Swiss and the English. And
Right.
they were just outnumbered, and they just couldn't get all on the same page. So while all this is going on, Van der Donck had been writing on behalf of the people to the home government to say, this terrible treatment that's going on, and we are not getting our rights, and we're not being heard, and the company government is treating the Native Americans terribly, and they're ruining our trade, and they're ruining our personal business prospects. And so they, you know, all properly legally done because he was trained for that. And so eventually he was recalled home to present the case, and he stayed for like 3 years. And they decided in his favor, and they were going to make Stuyvesant come and stand trial and account for himself. But that is at the same time that everything heated up with the English. And so they decided politically and militarily it wouldn't be a good time. And so he lost his case basically because it wasn't politically a good time. Like they actually awarded in his favor, and then like the next day came back and took it away. So it was like a crushing blow, and then made him stay in country. So his wife and all were, you know, I think the first year was still in Manhattan, and then came to be with him. But he just had to stay there. He just had to wait for permission to go back. But he loved it well enough eventually that Van der Donck went back. And the author talks about that. There are more than a few people throughout that make the trip back and forth from the homeland to the colony several times. That he says they just became American. You know, like they fell in love so much with it. And then having the cultural kind of predisposition because of how things were in Amsterdam, that they, I don't know, that kind of grew in them, you know, that freedom and that love of, like you said, the government things, the citizenship things that we've passed on now. And he calls that becoming American. So even though America wasn't a thing at the time.
Right.
So eventually England ended up winning the whole of it.
Well, I think considering all of that, like you said, that America wasn't a thing yet, maybe it was just the fact of it being this whole huge unexplored thing that people could come and claim. Must have been so amazing to them coming from Europe, where people have lived there for thousands of years. Like everything is claimed, everything has been farmed, like there's not really much up for grabs, and not really very many ways to work your way up in the station. It's just either a hereditary thing that you get or that you don't get. And so I think that probably has something to do with that that kind of mindset of coming here and loving it, because it's just like this beautiful, untouched, wild, open place that they can just come and kind of make their own and claim as their own.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think part of that is maybe hope, you know, because some of the people, like you said, that came over were kind of rough. You had prostitutes, you had some very poor people, you had some, she talked about like some of the Pilgrims and Puritans that came over, right? It was religious, but some of the Danish that came over were like the dregs, we really need people to come, so we're gonna pay your passage and give you some land to come. And it was kind of people that were settled didn't need it. So it was, there's, maybe a lot of hope there that, hey, things can change. And he does talk about that. There's where you pretty much weren't going anywhere different than where you already were if you stayed at home. But if you left, you had potential to change who you were and what your prospects were.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of big.
It totally is. And I like to think that that's still the way America is now. And hopefully that's what it means to people. And I think it's bigger than being an English influence or a Dutch influence. I think that's just a part of what America is.
Yes, I agree. I think that's just part of, I think like that goes into our beliefs, that America is just a special place. So I think the people that are led here, it is so that they have the freedom to become more and do more.
Mm-hmm.
So
it's a good thing to remember, because sometimes it just seems a little bleak. But it's not. It's really not.
I know, right? Especially in the cold, gray winter months. So, but it's not bad.
Yeah.
Good place.
So, that's all I have for this book. Was there anything else you wanted to cover?
I guess not specifically. It was definitely fascinating. Definitely more information than I can completely process in one go.
Well, I think this was like 30 years of research or something. I think I read that somewhere.
Okay.
And it's also close to 400 pages long.
But totally worth reading. Totally worth reading. So I hope people will read it. It's a good one.
So have you made a selection for next month's pick?
Yes. Yes. So Child reminded me that it's time to do Murder on the Orient Express.
Yes.
I've done Agatha Christie before, but believe it or not, I haven't done that one.
Have you seen any of the film adaptations?
I have not. Because I try to make myself not watch those things until I've read them. And since I haven't read that one yet.
Oh, yeah. We have to read it. And then it's in theaters right now.
Right now. And I think I saw a preview like a year and a half ago, and I got so excited about it. I was like, I have to read that. And all of a sudden, yes, my child said, "Did you see?" And the preview. I was like, oh my goodness, how did I let it go this far? So yes, I think like amazing cast. I think it's going to be a phenomenal adaptation. And there's multiple adaptations, so this is one of those. Like, after I read it, I can watch like 5 movies.
I've seen 2 of the previous one. The one from either the 70s or the 80s, and then the one with David Suchet in it. Okay. And I'm planning on seeing this one soon.
Yes, I'm so excited. I'm so excited. I'll go back and watch whichever ones I can get. But
yeah, so I have to say, I love Agatha Christie. And there's definitely a reason that this, I think, is pretty much her most famous book, because it's super influential in the genre, and it's an amazing story, and it has a huge twist. And the first time when I found out about the twist, like, I was like so shocked.
Really?
Like, usually things don't get me so much, but I was very shocked.
Okay, well now you have me feeling all suspenseful.
It's a really good book. I'm so excited.
I've read like the first maybe 4 chapters or so, so not, far enough.
Right.
Not very far in, but I don't know, things catch me off guard. I get like very into like the little, I don't know, the little things, and then I miss the glaring signs that other people catch. So I still get surprised when things happen. It should be fun. It should be an adventure.
Oh yeah, totally. I'm really excited.
Yeah, me too. Me too. So
that will be December's read, and we will update Goodreads and maybe Facebook, and we'll see about getting this episode posted. We've been having some difficulty since YouTube changed some things.
right.
But it'll happen eventually. So.
Then I'll just speak for
So thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.